Good evening, and welcome to the second spring lecture. Tonight, it is my pleasure to welcome Sharon Kugler, Chaplain of Yale, to speak as part of the Catholic Faculty Series, Life as a Scholar and Believer. Please submit any questions that you have via the STM Facebook page or the link bit.ly/STM lectures. Chaplain Kugler is the 7th chaplain of Yale and the first woman, layperson, and Catholic to serve in this role. Prior to coming to Yale in 2007, she was the University Chaplain at Johns Hopkins in Baltimore, where she served from 1993 to 2007. Chaplain Kugler received her master's degree from the Jesuit University, Georgetown, where her thesis, The Limits and Possibilities of Building a Religiously Plural Community, was used by the United States Department of Defense Office of the Chief of Chaplains as a training tool for new chaplains in the military. Chaplain Kugler has contributed to the book College and University Chaplaincy in the 21st Century, a multi-faith look at the practice of ministry on campuses across America, and teaches a course on chaplaincy at Yale Divinity School. Chaplain Kugler, welcome, and I turn it over to you as you tell us about your life as a scholar and believer.
Thank you, Sister Jen. I'm so happy to be here and I appreciate the invitation. I miss seeing you all very, very much. Sister Jen and I were reminiscing about what kind of Yorkside pasta we'd be enjoying right about now. So know that I can't wait till we're all back physically together. But I do love that I get to chat a little bit with you this evening. I first need to give a disclaimer. When I saw the title of this, my life as a scholar and a believer, and a very old picture of me, I thought, I'm not a scholar. I am a believer on my best days. And I'm a good 14 years older than that picture. And so I would just hope that I could also be a bit wiser. I consider myself a practitioner and have felt that way for pretty much all my adult life when it comes to practicing my faith, but also practicing ministry in the work that I do. I grew up Roman Catholic. I was the youngest of 5 children and a daily communicant with my mother, and enjoyed going to Catholic school from kindergarten on, and had a life that was filled with Catholic celebrations. And I had 44 first cousins on my mother's side. And so there were many weddings to celebrate and other sacraments in people's lives. And so I felt very much at home in the Catholic Church. I didn't know that I was going to be called to be in ministry in some way. I just knew that there was something special about my identity as a Catholic. And I think that came to me when I was preparing for confirmation. And I had a sister who was teaching me at the time. And she really impressed upon us that confirmation was a call to action. And it didn't mean that you got presents and you enjoyed some sort of new privilege. It was really, this is when the work begins. This is when you really have to put your life on the line and look for what is the work of Jesus in the corners, in the margins, where people aren't being paid attention to. And that was a powerful message to have when you're 14 years old. And so from then on, I kept thinking of my Catholic identity as something that was about action. In high school and college, I was exposed to the study of the social justice gospel and the preferential option for the poor. I became, I think, much more involved on the service end of campus ministry when I was an undergraduate. I went to a small Jesuit school in California. That's where I'm from originally. And I majored in math. So naturally, I would end up at Yale as the university chaplain. My bachelor's is in mathematics. But my involvement on campus was in social justice issues, and those were always rooted in the chaplain's office and in campus ministries. When I graduated from college, I went on to the Jesuit Volunteer Corps and was placed in Cleveland, Ohio, where I worked as a patient advocate in a free legal clinic. And I worked with women and children who were living in violent households. So I really thought I was going to be going to law school. And I think God had other plans for me. I got a call my second year in Cleveland. I was newly married. I had met my husband in Cleveland. He had been a former Jesuit volunteer corps member, and he was in law school. And I was studying to take the LSAT and never got out of the car. Just decided, I don't think this is for me. And I had gotten a call from Santa Clara, from my alma mater, inviting me to come back and be part of the campus ministry team. And so that's what we did. We moved across country and went back to California. And that's when I started my work in campus ministry. And that was 1984, 83. So from there, we grew as a couple, as a family. We had our first daughter in California, and then moved back to the East and went to Baltimore. And my first professional job in Baltimore was actually running a hospice for people with AIDS. This was in the mid-'80s. And I felt called to do that work from that same social justice rootedness that started to really flourish in me around 14. And it was hard work. It was painful work, but it was so clearly the work that I knew needed to be done. It was a time in Baltimore when people who were dying of AIDS had no one advocating for them. They couldn't go to hospices. There was only one funeral home in town that would even take care of a person who had passed away from AIDS. And so a number of church leaders from across traditions, Abrahamic traditions, came together and put seed money down to start a hospice for people with AIDS. And I was sharing actually with a divinity school student last week. I don't know what I was doing. I interviewed for that job. I had no idea how I was going to do it, but I did feel like I had a little bit of a head start because AIDS had been happening in California. I'd had friends who were active in trying to advocate for people who were just trying to get healthcare. And so I was a little bit ahead of the game, but I had no idea how to start hospice. But the board of directors for the organization that hired me had former campus ministers and chaplains on the board. So we all shared a love for the work, and we all just kind of hunkered down and tried to figure out how to create something in Baltimore for people who were in last stage AIDS. A little while later, a few years later, I had been asked by one of the former colleagues who was on that board to come and be a consultant at Johns Hopkins to look at their chaplaincy program. The chaplain that was there had resigned, and they weren't sure if they were going to keep the program. So that's how I ended up at Johns Hopkins. It's a very long story. I finished my graduate work at Georgetown University studying comparative religions. And 14 years later, I came to Yale. I think I'm going to stop talking and let you ask me a question, Sister Jen.
Well, I'm definitely not going to ask you any questions about math, but I do appreciate that that was your first degree, and also that it led you into ministry, and maybe we'll have more people who study math go into ministry and help out on the finance side of things. But I'm wondering, as a Catholic at a historically Protestant school, what is the impact of being the university chaplain, and what does it say about religious diversity at this point in our history?
Yeah, I was, I'd be lying if I didn't say I was daunted when I came to Yale. First of all, I didn't think I'd get the job. So that was the first thing. I thought, why would they have an interest in a Roman Catholic laywoman? But I had, I think I had established a kind of reputation nationally for the work that I was doing at Johns Hopkins around interreligious engagement and community building. And there seemed to be an interest at Yale to really take the chaplaincy to the next level in terms of matching the demographics of the student population that was on campus. And so I thought, if I can just bring myself up and just my essential self and trust that the work I'd been doing for all those years at Johns Hopkins was meaningful work and could actually expand to a place like Yale. I was willing to try. I'm, 14 years in, I can say that I was pretty scared when I first started. And I really suffered from what everybody suffers, which is that imposter syndrome. They must have made a mistake. Why would they ask me to come up here and do this work? And then when I arrived, I really found friendly people who were so happy to have me come. And the Catholic community was the first community to welcome me with open arms. And Father Bob, God bless him, really was a great early cheerleader, champion, and ear for me as I was trying to navigate all that was complicated about the Ivy League and Yale. And that, after a while, I got my sea legs and I discovered a willingness from the community to learn more about what this work looks like in the 21st century. And we were able to grow the chaplaincy fairly quickly. I was able to hire a full-time Muslim chaplain and a part-time Hindu chaplain, and then she later became full-time, and hire a pastor to serve the university church and oversee the Protestant communities on campus, and have an associate chaplain who works with graduate and professional schools. And we just really expanded the chaplaincy to what it is now, with there's 11 full-time people serving the campus, and the Yale Religious Ministries organization that St. Thomas More is part of expanded as well. And so it's just been this wonderful experience of learning alongside with the community and guiding them in terms of what it means to have a truly interreligious community, a campus that is made up of people from all different religious and spiritual traditions who are elevating their own tradition and also honoring other people. So it's not about a blending together so much as a highlighting of who's here and how it is we practice our faith.
So you work with professionals who are working within the context of their own traditions, but you yourself are working with students and others who come from all different faith traditions. I'm just wondering, how do you approach that from your own background and understanding your truth, but also listening to their truth? And when you're called on to lead prayer for university-wide services, how do you even begin to think about that?
Well, first of all, so many of the students that come to, our students, faculty, and staff that come to seek me out and want to talk, so few really start out with any kind of religious questions. It's life stuff, and they want to talk about their joys and their sorrows and their questions about life. And occasionally we'll veer into a religious topic, but it's usually the first thing is not anything specifically to do with religious or spiritual communities. There's so much to know about truth, and we know that we're always learning more about it, that there may be one, but we are always accumulating further knowledge. And so I look at all these different religious traditions as things that teach us about ourselves and our world. And they are meaningful to the people who are part of those religious communities, but they're also meaningful for those of us who are bearing witness to those communities. And I get to sit in this great seat where I am in all these different religious services all the time. This morning, I was in a service that was the University Church and Black Church at Yale. Just earlier in the week, I attended a Purim celebration with Hillel. There's so much richness in the religious communities at Yale, and I get to sit in the seat where I'm welcome at all those tables, and I get to bear witness to that. And on the large university celebrations, I'm often the one that's the mobile prayer unit, asked to give prayers to mark the occasion. And I really see myself as offering the prayer on behalf of the people. So if you see me pray publicly, you know that it's always we language, we before God. And we are asking God to be with us. I name all the different kinds of people that are here from different generations and tongues and cultures. But I try to remind people of the things that we have in common. The notion of love and hope and light are threads that weave through all of our traditions in one way or another. And so I try to construct the prayers to have meaning for as many people as possible, and also for people who don't subscribe to a religious tradition, but maybe appreciate pausing and giving some time up to something bigger than themselves. I do think that that is one of the most beautiful privileges I have in this role, is to bring people to a place of pausing and surrendering to a larger truth, to a larger existence in our universe, that we are so small and God is so big. And to try to just create small moments like that for a university community is really one of those special privileges that I don't take lightly at all. And I guess I would also say, when I'm called upon to convene a large group, when we've had, let's say, a tragedy on campus, we've had a death of a student or a beloved faculty or staff member, I also feel that to be a certain kind of privilege, to both minister to the families when you're with them in their hardest, most horrible nightmare in their lives, and suddenly the stranger is there also guiding them and holding them. I find that to be humbling, holy work. And I could not have imagined it for myself when I was 14 getting confirmed. And yet now at 62, I look back and I think how blessed I was to allow myself to hear a call to do this work.
Because as chaplains, we do have that opportunity to be with people at some of the best and some of the worst times in their lives. And chaplaincy really does require being on call 24 hours a day, oftentimes on weekends. How do you balance that with being married, with having children, with raising your children at different university settings? What are the blessings and maybe some of the challenges of that kind of work?
First and foremost, I'm blessed with a wonderful husband who has, I think, always seen my work as part of our vocation as a couple. When I was in Baltimore, he had a job that ended each day at 4:30. Our children were younger then, they're both older now. And so we were able to find that balance. I was able to construct a schedule for myself that would, have me be able to pick them up from school. Dwayne and I would tag team who was cooking dinner. And then if I had to go back to campus, he was on duty for bedtime. And we made it work. When I came to Yale, the children were older, and I now have 6 grandchildren. And so I could give a bit more of my time to my work than I think I could when my children were younger. And, for me, I've just known my entire life in ministry that I was blessed to have a partner in life that believed in the work that I was doing and made sacrifices to make sure that our family could stay whole. And I've been able to look at my daily schedule now with no children or dependents at home, but also knowing that it's important to try to practice a kind of self-care and pay attention to taking walks, exercise, and my own prayer practice, so that I can greet the day ready to go and be present for people who need whatever they're going to need from me. So before I log on to email, I connect with God and connect with my own kind of sense of how I'm putting my feet on the ground that day.
You mentioned wrestling with imposter syndrome. This is certainly something that our students wrestle with. I'm also just thinking that there are lots of different topics students come to. Sometimes it's about those topics first and then God, and sometimes it's God first and then they realize that they also need to talk about all the other topics. I'm just thinking right now, things that relate to their spirituality of racism and suffering, love, relationships, death, all of these major life topics. But what are the things that you yourself have maybe learned about this over time, and how do you offer advice and ways to think through them with students?
Yeah, the imposter syndrome is such a paralyzing thing, and it runs through the water, it feels like. I've had these conversations with students, faculty, and staff, and I think especially at Yale, where students push themselves, where this idea of perfection, which should just be scrapped off the books, is something that is impossible to attain, and it's not healthy. And I think one of the things that we've learned from this pandemic is that there is this danger of feeling like, oh, I'm sitting in one place, so I must be much more productive. I have to do better. I have to do better. I've got to fix every social ill that I now see so clear in Technicolor because the fissures have just been, thrown open, and it feels overwhelming. And the kinds of conversations I was having with students before pandemic and now really kind of center around a similar thing, which is you are enough as God has made you. Your job is to figure out where God's leading you. And I preached a sermon a couple of years ago about I want to live a resurrection life and what that meant. And a resurrection life is not this sort of A+ life. It's more of a C+ life. It's one that recognizes all of our shortcomings, the things that really are limits in our lives, and then the things that those limits actually allow for us to see as gifts. And I know that sounds weird, but it's this idea that, the things that are broken and hard to look at are the very things that we need to touch. They're the very things that are looking for our care. It's where God is leading us. I know, I feel inspired by the work of Sister Helen Prigine, and she had received an honorary degree from Yale a couple of years ago. And spending some time with her and just being around this person who's just as God made her, doesn't put on airs, filled with the joy of life, and yet she sees so much suffering. And I think for her draw to ministry and to being around people who are on death row and people who have done horrible things is bringing a sense of humanity and their sense of being a child of God alive for them. And it's hard work, but it's simple words. And she felt alive when she started doing that work. And I think that if you can find a calling that helps you come alive, and it doesn't have to be in big, shiny ways, it can be in the simplest of ways. I'm remembering a conversation I had with a student who just felt like she was disappointing God. She'd made some questionable social decisions. She had drank too much one weekend. She was feeling very, distant from her parents, and she had gone through a horrible trauma in her life. And all of this was adding up into this kind of, I'm disappointing God. And so we prayed together, and the prayer was really about letting God hold her, that God's there in all the darkness. But sometimes we forget that. And we forget that we actually are being held by God, and allowing ourselves to just feel that and feel empowered by that can help us get to the next day and help us to see others, I think, in much more tender terms. Because once we recognize our humanness with each other, this stuff about, do I belong? Am I enough? All of that goes in that pile of not helpful, goes in that perfection seeking, not helpful pile. So that's.
And I'm guessing you probably have students who come back years later and thank you for that. And when they realize out in life beyond Yale that all of that really is helpful. You were talking about darkness. I think now at this point in history, we're almost to a year of COVID, or really within the United States, a year of COVID being present, and it's changed the landscape of everything, right? So finances have changed, how people work have changed, ministry has certainly changed. How has the pandemic changed how you view chaplaincy, how you relate to the other chaplains, how you relate to students? What kind of techniques have you used within this new context?
And it's been very surprising in some ways. I think when we first started in this Zoom world, it was all about just trying to figure out what the heck is this technology? How do we even humanize this? Is it possible to humanize it? I was getting a lot of students contacting me, wanting to talk to me who I'd never met, and it worried me because we're not going to be physically in the same room. I can't offer them a cup of tea or a cup of coffee or something. How are they going to feel comfortable talking to a perfect stranger about something that's really tugging on their hearts across screens? And the weird thing is that we got used to it. And so I'll have appointments in any given week, and maybe 40% of them will be people I knew, and 60% will be all new students, faculty, or staff that are making appointments to want to talk. And it feels like we get to the heart of the matter much more quickly. And I want to remember that when we get back to in person, because the small talk is absent in a kind of Zoom pastoral care setting. It just isn't necessary. And so that's been a little bit of a surprise. How do you create an environment of a radical welcome? It's hard. It's hard when people are exhausted being on Zoom all day. Students by the end of the day have just had it. They've had all their classes on Zoom. They don't want to come to another event. So it's trying to figure out ways to spread love and care that isn't about Zoom. We, probably like you and many of the other religious communities on campus have been creating care packages and trying to give people little goodies and things to remind them to take care of themselves and stuff to break up the doldrums of winter. I mean, I've been concerned about this semester because there's no real break. There are little break days peppered here and there, and February and March is notoriously tough. So we're on, a kind of high alert to pay attention and to be open to new ways of creating connection between people. I also have found that just talking on the phone is really a wonderful thing when people are done with being on screen, but they want to hear another human voice. So we've been doing a lot of that. I have absolutely been blown away by some of the religious services I've seen on Zoom and on live stream. When you couldn't think, that anything was possible, that people could connect spiritually across these divides, and I've seen it happen. Choirs have figured out a way to sing, and that has all been very touching. I was in a chapel, Marquand, the Divinity School chapel service. I was in a chapel service in the fall where I knew there were at least 2 people who were tuning into that service from their hospital bed. And it made me think, I want to remember this. I want to remember that there are people who cannot make community events because they physically just can't do it. And yet this opportunity was afforded them and they became part of a community. And so I do want to remember that when we come out of this and think of ways to broaden our audience, because that's been the positive part of this, is being able to learn that there's a broader community out there that's looking to connect. They just couldn't before for various reasons. I have loved being in touch with all the other chaplains and the Yale Religious Ministries folks and hearing what they're doing. It's been hard to have to put limitations on people and to remind them that this is a pandemic and we've all got to just kind of hunker down and keep at this. Everyone wants it to end, but it is something that is not forever. The only thing that's forever is forever. And so that's what I keep trying to remind people, and just to, try to just be patient a few more months, and we can get to the end of this.
I think you're right. Sometimes there are the benefits of Zoom that we hopefully will be able to continue on with. We have a group of students who are praying morning prayer together at 8 a.m., which I'm guessing would not be rolling out of bed and dressed in somewhere at 8 a.m., but if they can turn on their computers, then they're willing to join prayer from home and have their cup of coffee. And we have students from around the world that are able to participate even when they're not on campus. So there are definitely some benefits to that. We do have a question from one of our audience members asking, why do you think that on Zoom people aren't using small talk during the appointments?
Yeah, I kind of wondered about that myself. I think there's less to distract you. So if somebody was visiting my office, they would see a collection of snow globes. The tackier, the better. I have probably 100 by now. And so that's going to attract their attention. They're going to see colorful wall hangings and a basket full of wind-up toys on my coffee table, all kinds of distractions that are there to sort of soften the space so that people feel a sense of playfulness and warmth and welcome. But on Zoom, I mean, short of maybe a dog coming by or something like that, or a cat in the screen, it's just you and them. And so I think if somebody is willing to connect with someone they have not met, so in other words, reaching out to talk to a chaplain, I think they appreciate a kind of gentle directness. And I've just found that we'll say hello, nice to meet you, and then I'll ask, what's weighing on your heart this day that led you to try to have an appointment with me? And we just go right in. It's interesting. There's something you just said, Jen, though, before this question that I wanted to respond to, and now I've kind of like drawn a blank.
About Zoom reaching different audiences or benefits?
Yeah, thank you. One thing we discovered, so my colleagues, Associate Chaplain Jenny Peak and Maytal Satyal in our office were doing anti-racist book groups, How to Be an Anti-Racist, Ibram Kendi's book. And they were getting people joining that book club, the book clubs. They ended up having to do 3 of them that never would have been able to do it. We had students from the School of Nursing, med students, staff from the library, all over, because they didn't have to find our office, take their lunch and park or whatever. And so the book groups, we want to keep that in Zoom in some fashion, because the wonderful mixture of across generations too, that were interested in being part of those book groups was really, really spoke to us. So that's something we want to keep.
Okay, so I have to ask, what's the story behind the snow globes?
Oh, I love that you asked that. My very first snow globe, I accumulated in 2001, shortly after having a diagnosis of cancer. And I was at Johns Hopkins at the time. And there's a neighborhood just adjacent to Johns Hopkins that had really fun, kitschy stores. And a good friend of mine, to cheer me up, bought me a snow globe with a nun in it. And she said, "You're going to need this while you go through chemo." And so I love that snow globe with the nun. And she was in full habit, black and white. And And then friends would send them to me. So I had the I Love Lucy, Vitamin to Vegemin snow globe. And then of course, Elvis, I had an Elvis snow globe. And then I started just accumulate them when I would travel. And then people who knew would send me snow globes. I have one from the Spam Museum. There's a Spam Museum. I have a snow globe from there. When I retire, those things are going to have to go out into the world in some way. But yeah, that's the story behind the snow globe. Just a little magic.
So I think one of the things I do want to go back to from your earlier research, your graduate research was picked up by the Department of Defense. So can you just talk about, first of all, how did that happen? Because most people don't read master's theses. And then also, what do you think is key today in terms of training people who are in the military doing chaplaincy? Certainly it's chaplaincy, but it's in a very different setting.
So I finished that thesis in the late 90s. And obviously I was in Baltimore at the time. I definitely wanted to write something practical. So the thesis itself contained a kind of guidebook for creating interreligious dialogue, how to do groups, the pitfalls of trying to do interfaith services where you throw everything in and everyone's equally offended. And so I did a little writing about that, and also ministry on a college campus when there's been trauma. So I wrote about a murder that had happened at Johns Hopkins. One student had shot another in front of several other students, and how across religious traditions we came together to try to care for the larger community. So right around the same time that I finished that thesis, we had moved the chaplaincy into a brand new facility. It wasn't new, it was a former United Methodist church that the university had purchased, and we created an interfaith center out of the church. The church congregation had since really drifted to just a handful of people. And so we had a big opening for this church, and there were lots of, for this interfaith center rather, and there were lots of people that came from various parts of the Baltimore and Washington area. I do not know how this person came, but someone from the Chief Chaplain's office, I'm not sure who invited them, came to the opening of the Interfaith Center and later asked for an appointment to meet me. We had a huge dedication. It was a very celebratory day, and lots of religious leaders were there, but this was one of the first, follow-up kind of messages I got. So she came with another member of the Chief Chaplain's office and came really just wanting to know how I do the work I do. So that's when I referred to my thesis, and I asked her if she wanted it. And because they were trying to create a training tool for chaplains in the military, because they were seeing that the religious demographics were changing and reflecting the demographics that we see in American society. And so that's how that all started. And I saw my thesis kind of put into a PowerPoint that was used in the early days. This was again before 9/11. And so it was definitely a pioneering work at the time. There's much more work done after 9/11. But I do take pride that we were doing this work before it became important to learn about other religious traditions and to engage with each other. So that's how that came to be.
You also talked about your ministry with patients with AIDS, and that was at a time when AIDS was still a very scary disease and not managed in the same way it is now. Did you yourself have fear about working in that setting, and how did you get through that if you did? Or if not, then what gave you the peace to be able to work there?
Didn't really have fear because, as I said, in California, we were a little bit more ahead in what we knew about transmission. And I had close friends that were doing work with people with AIDS in San Francisco, or who had friends that had passed. I really did feel like it was it was God calling you to the margins. And so when I saw that advertisement for that position in Baltimore, it was advertised in the Catholic newspaper, I really felt drawn to give it a try. In the early days, the hardest part was teaching people about transmission and dealing with their fears. My appointment was very public, so I was on the news. There were neighbors that we had that had concerns that I was doing this work. And so they kept their distance from me and our one child at the time. And then, things evolved and people learned that, you couldn't get it from a sneeze and stuff like that. But I can remember going and trying to fundraise and going to different church groups and synagogues and giving it a little talk about what it was we were trying to do and see if they would be interested in supporting us. And there was some hesitancy to shake my hand and stuff like that. But when we started to be able to open a facility, and it was really with the great sort of underground guerrilla of grace of a Sister of Mercy who helped us obtain a house in town that was owned by the order, that we brought our first patients in. And really the thought of just being able to care for them, to train volunteers to care for them, to bring love and warmth and even humor in the hardest of times, watching the devastation of the end stage AIDS. This was before there were any cocktails and medications that could really prolong life. It was nothing short of feeling like you were touching the face of God in some way as you sat with the suffering. But more importantly, if you could bring some kind of light, some warmth. And I watched that all the time with volunteers that were either retired people or college students that really felt called to also come and work at the hospice. It just was hard work, devastating work, and beautiful all at the same time.
You talked about working on the margins, and that's definitely something Pope Francis has certainly encouraged, and for everybody in the church to really put ourselves on the margins and to be there. If you had to define the margins right now, what would you say might be the marginalized parts of the church that we still need to address and still need to put ourselves in contact with?
I think LGBTQ people who don't feel seen, much less loved. I think the churches that are keeping it together on a wing and a prayer, that don't have the kind of resources that some other churches do and are fortunate to have, but are trying to stay alive in neighborhoods that are really struggling. I see, people struggling with mental illness who, may feel like they're a mess and might not feel welcome to be in church. And that's the absolute opposite of, I think, what the Catholic Church should be about. When I was growing up, I mentioned I had 4 brothers. My third oldest brother was severely disabled and was institutionalized from the time I was born. He was 11 when I was born. I never knew him living at home, but we were always visiting him, and he was in a mental institution for all of his life, from the time he was probably about 9. And at one point, where he was probably only about 20 minutes from our house. And so we were able to go and visit him more often. It wasn't a 2-hour journey for the family. And there was a Jesuit priest who was the chaplain at the hospital at the time, who contacted my mom and asked if my brother, his name was Bobby, would like to receive communion. And I mean, you have to picture the ward that my brother would be on. If you ever saw One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, that was the closest thing to this kind of ward that my brother would be on. People were in various states of catatonic, some were catatonic, some were just rocky. My brother was a rocker. He would rock all the time and never spoke. But this priest, Father Burns, he thought it was important for patients on this ward to receive Eucharist. And nothing was more of a gift to my mother than to see her son receive Eucharist every week, sometimes twice a week. And we would go and I'd look around and I'd see all these people that are cast away from society, that are truly broken, receiving the Eucharist. And it was like a kind of wholeness would just encompass us in this little chapel area in this mental institution at Santa Clara, California. And the priest would be glowing and my brother would be glowing. Who knows if he knew what he was actually receiving, but there was just this beauty in the room, and you have to believe that was the Holy Spirit right there. And I think about all the times that we don't look closely at the people who aren't important to us. They're not part of our, or we think they're not part of what's going to get us to the next accomplishment, when in fact, they are the very thing that is an accomplishment, to acknowledge their humanity, to love them into their own self-understanding and love of themselves. It's, there's so much work we can do for each other in this world. There's so much need that we don't have to, it doesn't have to be some fancy thing. It can be the simplest of things, connecting to another person, another human being, something St. Thomas More does so beautifully with the soup kitchen work, and has been for so long, just sharing a meal, giving someone something they need because they're a human being, not because they failed in something in their life. That's going to the margins.
We have time for just a couple more questions, so if anybody in the audience wants to send something in, please do so. I do want to say, though, just like that was such a beautiful story of witness, right, of what community and communion actually looks like, and in places that maybe are surprising, and I'm guessing probably influenced much of your life's work, even if it wasn't necessarily the inspiration as you were going to study math, but glad that that became part of it later on. I'm just thinking, when you work with students now who are thinking about chaplaincy, or students who are looking at going into ministry in general, what advice do you have for them, or what would you encourage them to think about?
Well, I do teach a class on chaplaincy at the Divinity School, and I talk to them about it, that if you're going to feel called to ministry, you have to be comfortable with ambiguity. And I think that's certainly true for college and university chaplaincy. You just never know. You can't really make a plan. So I say to them at the first day of class, you're going to have lots of questions for me in the course of the next 12 weeks. And more often than not, my answer is going to be, it depends. And I think that that frustrates them no end in the beginning. And then we get a rhythm going over time, over the course of the semester. And they start to get it. Oh, okay. This isn't something I can create a list. This is what this entails. This is the kind of person that is a chaplain. No two chaplains are alike. We're a quirky bunch. And those of us that last in this work last because we know how to laugh and we know how to ask for help. And we also are struck by wonder. I'm always learning something new. And so I talk to students about, how do you know you want to be a chaplain or go into ministry? What draws you to it now? Is it that you want to be like this person? Or what is it about yourself that you want to break open and bring into the world? And so it's the beginning of a conversation. I certainly didn't know it when I was 20 years old or even 24 years old, that this was something I really felt called to do. I do encourage students to take a little time into the world and do some service work or do something else before going into another graduate program. I think you're a better student once you've been out in the world a little bit. You're more able to wrestle with all the tasks of being a student and also being a human being with a little more balance. And so I know when I went back to school later in life with 2 kids, I was much more efficient and felt more on equal footing in the classroom with my professors. And so I always err on the side of wait a little while.
I know when I first began in campus ministry, people kept asking me if I was one of the undergrads. So yes, I think it's helpful to be a few years older than the students are. Now I appreciate it anytime somebody asks me if I'm a student, but we'll ignore age for the moment. I do have somebody who wrote in and asked, do you have any tips for being comfortable with ambiguity? Not necessarily just in chaplaincy, but in life. How do you deal with ambiguity?
Well, I have struggled with real challenges in my own life, and whether it's a physical illness or, the death of, of a sibling or parents. And you just get to a place that there's so much that you can't control. And so that in and of itself is a bit of a gift. It's just realizing, oh, okay, I'm not going to be able to control this. So I'm going to admit when I'm scared, and I'm going to ask for help, and I'm going to keep my friends close around me. I think it goes back a little bit to that imposter thing of thinking everybody else knows something you don't know. It's like, life is filled with like really weird twists and turns, and things get gnarly. And, as a parent and a grandparent, I've seen that over and over and over again. And you look back and you say, oh, I could have done better at this, or how did I get through that? Well, you just keep going. And I definitely learned that from my dad, who was orphaned at the age of 9. Both his parents died within months of each other, and he was in and out of orphanages. And, he grew up in the Depression. And so I think I kind of grew up watching somebody who just kept going, who didn't expect that everything was going to turn out great, because things weren't great from the beginning for him. So he never had that expectation. And so I think we were sort of raised just to do our best and see how we could care for others, because we were lucky to still be standing. And I've always kind of felt that was my dad in me. You got up this morning, okay, thank God. So there you go.
It's true. There's people in each of our lives, I think, who inspire us. We had somebody write in from Anaheim asking, what have you learned from your friendship with Father Bob about your own relationship, and how did he influence your life?
Thank you for that question. Well, so I was worried when I was offered the job at Yale that, what would the Catholic community be like? What would they think of a lay woman coming into this role? And after I had said yes, I was on campus, and Harry and Jan Attridge, the then dean of the Divinity School, drove myself and my husband over to Mass. And Harry, I think, leaned into Father Bob and she said yes. And Bob just wrapped his arms around me and said, I'm so glad. And I just exhaled. It was a great feeling. The Holy Spirit was playing tricks on me that day. One of the hymns was, Here I Am, Lord. I think I just broke down in tears in the chapel. But, Bob and I took long walks and had long lunches and laughed a lot and talked about ministry and talked about creation and the wonder of nature. He would come and visit me in my house. I'm here in Groton. I'm in the attic of the house in Groton that he loves so much. And we would look at the birds and mostly just talk about the beauty of ministry and the things we kept learning. And, you know, he was my priest and I miss him every day. But I also am just beyond grateful that I got to have that time with him when I came to Yale.
You mentioned the walks at the beach, so this will be the last question, but when you do actually have time off, what are your guilty pleasures? So your favorite TV shows, things to do, where do you like to eat, where do you want to travel to, what's on your bucket list?
I love going out to eat, so that'll be fun when we can do that again. But I have to say that what has been relaxing for me in pandemic has been cooking, not baking. I haven't done the sourdough thing or any of that, but I just love experimenting. My husband has been the happy recipient of all my experimenting and tweaking of recipes that appear in my inbox. And so that's something I do to relax and read. I've been reading lots of books and just enjoying all different kinds of literature and nonfiction. And I'm a podcast aficionado. I love popular culture podcasts. I like science podcasts. I geek out with that stuff. And so it's me and my dog on long walks, and I'm pretty simple that way. I mean, I'd love to travel again. I'd love to go back to Ireland. But I honestly can tell you, I feel so incredibly blessed that I am content in my skin right now and grateful that I'm still here.
Well, Chaplain Kugler, it's been so wonderful to have you with us. I feel blessed with your presence as part of our community and with part of the Yale community in general. I just want to thank you for sharing about your life as a scholar and believer, and I want to invite all of our audience members to join us again in 2 weeks for the Calabrese Fellowship in Faith and Law. Thank you again for joining us tonight, and have a good evening.